Well, today we're talking about the crash of November 17 Delta Tango, the Cirrus SR22 that crashed near Shelbyville, Indiana, killing the newly minted private pilot and his CFI. The NTSB probable cause was, quote, both pilots' failure to maintain adequate airspeed during departure from the airport, which led to the airplane exceeding its critical angle of attack, entering an aerodynamic stall, and impacting terrain. Well, this tells us what happened. It doesn't tell us how and why they got into that situation. But in a rare move, the NTSB published the data that the aircraft captured itself. And by merging that data with ADSB data, I was able to create a video that shows exactly what happened. And in my opinion, the pilots were doing a training maneuver, an emergency approach and landing to a cornfield that went horribly wrong. And Rob Mark and I will tell you why. Also today, I'll be playing an audio clip of something I heard over the radio, and I'll be reading a couple of your emails. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in episode 411, we talked with Rob Mark about a Vision Jet nose gear collapse incident that the NTSB says was likely caused by the pilot raising the landing gear. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/411. So if you're new to this show, welcome. Glad you found us. And if you would, take a moment to touch either the subscribe key or if you're using Spotify or the Apple Podcast app, the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And just a quick reminder that whenever you buy a new Lightspeed headset, Lightspeed will send a check to support Aviation News Talk, but only if you first go to this special link we've set up for you to get to their website. And that link is aviationnewstalk.com/lightspeed. And if you've been listening to the show for a while and feel that you're getting value from it, why not make a donation? Think perhaps about what you might pay an instructor for an hour or two of good instruction. And then support the show by going to aviationnewstalk.com/support. Coming up on the news for the week of January 26, 2026, NTSB releases preliminary report on the Greg Biffle citation crash in North Carolina. The Reagan National Mid-Air Collision probable cause was announced. And we have a follow-up to our Bad Boys file. All this and more when the news starts now. From avweb.com, Greg Biffle crash followed instrument failure and cockpit confusion. Greg Biffle's Cessna Citation 550 encountered multiple instrument failures and communication issues before crashing near the runway at Statesville Regional Airport in North Carolina in December, according to the NTSB preliminary report. Biffle's aircraft departed Statesville shortly after 10 a.m. on a personal flight to Sarasota, Florida. The pilot, a retired airline captain with multiple type ratings, took off VFR with the intention of activating an IFR clearance once airborne. The AWOS reported calm winds with 10-mile visibility, 3,900-foot broken and 4,800-foot overcast ceilings, and a temperature of 7 degrees C. On board were 7 people, including 2 additional people with pilot certificates, one of whom was seated in the right seat. That person, an instrument-rated single-engine private pilot, was not qualified to serve as second-in-command. Even so, the left-seat pilot controlled the fully fueled jet, while the right-seat passenger handled radio calls and checklists. Cockpit voice recordings, along with reports from nearby ground personnel, confirmed that the left engine did not start up on the first attempt. Both engines were nonetheless running before the aircraft began taxiing. The pilot and passengers discussed a malfunctioning thrust reverser indicator, though the reversers themselves appeared functional. After departing from runway 10, the airplane climbed in a left turn. At approximately 2,200 feet, it began to descend. The right-seat passenger attempted to contact ATC to activate the flight's IFR clearance, but those transmissions were unanswered due to the controller's workload at the time. Around the same time, one of the pilot passengers noted a difference between the left and right ITT temperature indications, although no further discussions regarding engine instruments came up for the remainder of the recording. At 4,500 feet, the pilot reported an altitude indicator issue, something we talked about in a prior episode, along with the possibility of other left-side instrument problems. The aircraft's Garmin GTN 750 stopped recording airspeed at about that time, along with heading data about a minute later. Autopilot also disengaged around the same time, though it is not clear whether this was intentional or not. The right-seat passenger, who did not verbally report instrumentation issues on the right side of the flight deck, took the controls for a moment. The aircraft descended to about 1,800 feet by 10:13 a.m. Audio recordings suggest the pilot took control of the aircraft back at about that time and turned right back toward the airport. The pilot called out flap and gear extension, but the landing gear indicator lights were not illuminated. A few moments later, the right seat passenger transmitted on the CTAF saying, "We're having some issues here." Although there is no alternator on the aircraft, one of the passengers asked the pilot about power to the alternator, and about 4 seconds afterward, audio recording quality improved, and the pilot responded that that was the problem. He did not elaborate further on what was meant by that, though there were no further references to instrumentation troubles for the remainder of the flight. Garmin N1750 airspeed data resumed seconds afterwards. Data indicates the aircraft rolled out on runway heading at about 1,240 feet and 114 knots. Airspeed declined steadily over the next 30 seconds during the final descent. The aircraft crashed short of the runway. The pilot held a CE 500 type rating with a second-in-command limitation, meaning he was required to have another pilot who met the requirements for a second-in-command pilot. The right seat occupant, a private pilot with a single-engine land and instrument rating, was not qualified to serve in the role of second-in-command. The aircraft was not equipped with a flight data recorder and was not required to carry one. Investigators recovered a cockpit voice recorder and extracted roughly 31 minutes of audio, though poor audio quality hampered parts of the review. Limited flight data was recovered from the GTN 750. And the Reagan National Mid-Air Collision Final Report is out. The NTSB held a public board meeting this past Tuesday, January 27th, on the mid-air collision that occurred over the Potomac River near Ronald Reagan National Airport. The board discussed their findings and voted on a probable cause findings and safety recommendations designed to prevent similar crashes. I watched the entire 10-hour hearing and will play some of those excerpts on an upcoming episode of NTSB News Talk podcast. Now here's a recording of the probable cause the board voted on as read by Member Graham, who we had on as a guest back in episode 13 of NTSB News Talk.
Thank you, Chair, and I appreciate staff and the individual members of working individually with me on this. I move to amend the probable cause to read, and I'm not even going to read, well, I guess you got a red line in there. That's pretty good. I'm just going to read the whole thing because I can't read through those red lines right now. The NTSB, my motion is to amend the probable cause to read. The NTSB determines that the probable cause of this accident was the FAA's placement of a helicopter route in close proximity to a runway approach path, their failure to regularly review and evaluate helicopter routes and available data, and their failure to act on recommendations to mitigate the risk of a mid-air collision near Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, as well as the air traffic system's over-reliance on visual separation in order to promote efficient traffic flow without consideration for the limitations of the see and avoid concept. Also causal was the lack of effective pilot-applied visual separation by the helicopter crew, which resulted in a mid-air collision. Additional causal factors were the tower team's loss of situational awareness and degraded performance due to a high workload of the combined helicopter and local control positions and the absence of a risk assessment process to identify and mitigate real-time operational risk factors, which resulted in misprioritization of duties, inadequate traffic advisories, and the lack of safety alerts to both flight crews. Also causal was the Army's failure to ensure pilots were aware of the effects of air tolerances on barometric altimeters in their helicopters, which resulted in the crew flying above the maximum published helicopter route altitude. Contributing factors include the limitations of the traffic awareness and collision alerting systems on both aircraft, which precluded effective alerting of the impending collision to the flight crews, an unsustainable airport arrival rate, increasing traffic volume with a changing fleet mix, and airline scheduling practices at DCA, which regularly strain the DCA ATCT workforce and degraded safety over time. The Army's lack of a fully implemented safety management system, which should have identified and addressed hazards associated with altitude exceedances on the Washington, D.C. helicopter routes. The FAA's failure across multiple organizations to implement previous NTSB recommendations, including ADS-BN, and to follow and fully integrate its established safety management system, which should have led to several organizational and operational changes based on previously identified risks that were known to management, and the absence of effective data sharing and analysis among the FAA, aircraft operators, and other relevant organizations.
From globalair.com, AOPA Air Safety Institute suggests icing as a factor in the Challenger 650 crash. The Air Safety Institute stated on Tuesday that icing was likely a factor in the crash of November 10 Kilo Juliet, a Bombardier Challenger 650 that crashed in Maine on Sunday. The aircraft was departing Bangor International when it crashed near the runway. All 6 people on board died. The Institute states that around the time of the takeoff there was light snow with 3/4 of a mile visibility, an overcast ceiling of 1,200 feet, and a temperature of 3 degrees Fahrenheit. The Challenger crew configured the aircraft for takeoff before de-icing and had only a few minutes to get off the ground before the protective ice fluid was expected to fail. The crew requested the de-icing starting at 7:17 p.m. Before the Challenger took off, an Allegiant flight on the same runway requested time to perform a tactile check on the aircraft and reported that they needed to return to the ramp due to failed de-icing fluid and poor visibility. The Allegiant pilot confirmed on the ground control frequency that the powdery snow then falling had begun to stick to the aircraft. The Challenger reported ready to taxi at 7:35 p.m., cleared for takeoff at 7:42, and crashed at 7:45. The time interval between the application of the fluid and takeoff is expected to be longer than the anti-ice fluid can effectively prevent wing contamination. The acceptable interval between the application of de-icing and anti-ice fluids and flight is no more than 10 minutes of holdover because of the weather conditions, according to the FAA holdover time guidelines. The audio recording and ADS-B data show the Challenger crew did not take as much time conducting pre-takeoff checks as the Allegiant crew had. The Allegiant's crew inspection took 7 minutes at the hold short line, and the Challenger's took 30 seconds. It's unclear if the Challenger crew had time to conduct a visual inspection for wing contamination from the cabin. And also from globalair.com, Hollywood Burbank Airport at risk of mid-air collision. NTSB Chair Jennifer Hamady warned that the Burbank Airport could be at risk for a mid-air collision during Tuesday's NTSB hearing. The hearing was part of the NTSB investigation into the 2025 Potomac mid-air collision. Hamady warned that commercial airline operators at Burbank have repeatedly raised concerns about the risk of aircraft colliding. Burbank is a medium-sized airport with short runways, a tight airspace, and a high volume of mixed helicopter and airplane traffic. Hamady said, quote, "I keep hearing about other areas in the airspace where they're concerned. Burbank is one where commercial airlines have called me to say the next mid-air is going to be at Burbank, and nobody at the FAA is paying attention to us. So whether it is involving helicopters or not, people are raising red flags, and why aren't people listening? The FAA has to ensure safety. That is their job." There have been 6 reported near mid-air collisions at Burbank since January 1st, 2021, according to avweb.com. A statement issued the following day by the Burbank Airport said, quote, "The safety of our guests, staff, tenants, and all stakeholders, while they are at Hollywood Burbank Airport, is our top priority." The FAA responded in a statement that the airport is a safety hotspot and that it has been working to help alleviate the risks since the collision. The FAA lowered the Van Nuys traffic pattern by 200 feet to see if that would reduce conflicts with aircraft landing at Burbank, and claimed that data showed a reduction of TCAS alerts for arrivals to the airport. And finally, from our Bad Boys file, this comes from FBI.gov. Yes, that FBI. Promote a man arrested and charged with operating an unregistered aircraft at municipal airports. A man was arrested on Tuesday for suspicion of operating an unregistered aircraft. 38-year-old man from Pomona was charged in a federal criminal complaint filed in U.S. District Court in Los Angeles on Wednesday. According to the complaint, a single-engine aircraft was reported stolen by the owner on January 3rd at Auburn Municipal Airport in Washington. The aircraft was recovered on January 6th at the Corona Municipal Airport in Corona, California. Corona police determined that the transponder had been manipulated during the flight in order to conceal where the plane had been over a 3-day period. However, the airplane was physically seen at another airport in Kelso, Washington on January 4th, where a couple, driving a rented vehicle, was suspected of having flown in the aircraft. The couple was then linked to a second suspected aircraft theft on January 27th at the Corona Airport of a plane that had not been registered since 2017. At that time, FBI agents conducting surveillance witnessed the man enter that aircraft and start the airplane's engine. They concluded he was in the process of stealing the plane and took him into custody. The man is not a registered pilot, and he admitted to being under the influence of methamphetamine when operating the plane. He had an initial appearance before a federal magistrate on Thursday and was released on bond. So beware, as this seems like a catch-and-release program for airplane thieves. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates, and then our conversation with Rob Mark about the crash of a Cirrus during an emergency approach to landing. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's get to the good news. Congratulations to Wayne White, who passed his commercial. He says, I'm a 70-year-old instrument-rated pilot. I just passed my commercial check ride. I don't plan to use my commercial privileges, but it was a great review and did count as a flight review. I want to thank you for your advice on check ride anxiety a few years ago. It was fun hearing my name mentioned during that podcast. Keep up the good work. Wayne, congratulations to you. And I want to mention that another one of my columns from Flying Magazine is now available online for free for anybody who wants to check it out. It was called Pattern Problems, Why Sloppy Entries Can Lead to Close Calls. And I said in part, pilots tend to focus on takeoffs and landings, which makes sense since they're critical phases of flight. By comparison, the approach to a landing or even the entry into a traffic pattern garners less attention, probably because it seems trivial compared to landing an airplane. And I talk about a couple of instances, including one of mine, where not having thought out how to enter a traffic pattern resulted in a problem. And oddly, in one recent incident, a low-time pilot I was flying with was confused as to which runway he was on the downwind for. And if that had not been the case, he would have turned less than a half mile in front of a Pilatus during a straight-in approach. And I later found out that Pilatus was being flown by Rob Lober of Air Tahoe, who we've had on the show. Rob was prepared to go around when I announced that we were departing the pattern. In the article, I'll show you how you can place a pen over the HSI or DG and turn the pen to the runway number, which helps you with your orientation when looking out the window to identify the runways. So check that out. I'll have a link for you in the show notes. And if you don't subscribe to Flying Magazine, you might consider doing that at flyingmag.com. And here's an email from listener Tom Quinn. He says, "Good day, Max. In reference to your technique of selecting the 1 nautical mile range ring on the moving map for assistance in identifying how far your downwind leg is offset from the runway," that's episode 410. And I talked in that case about a pilot in Bakersfield who's lost his engine at over 10,000 feet, but then he started his downwind at 6,000 feet. But he didn't understand how different the view is from a high altitude when trying to determine how far offset your downwind is from the runway. And he flew a pattern that was too wide, which created a base leg that was so long that he didn't make it back to the runway. Anyway, Tom continues. Let's see, episode 410, including during a high-altitude return to the field. It's brilliant. On a recent cross-country trip while at 6,000 feet AGL, I selected the 1 nautical mile ring, then compared where landmarks passed under my wing. I was shocked. These landmarks passed under the plane much closer to the fuselage than expected. I will continue to check this reference often during straight and level flight, especially on long legs, to imprint in my memory where to place potential landing spots under my wing during partial power situations with caps at the ready. I would encourage all to practice this often. Thanks for the idea. Fly often and safely. Signed, Tom. 18,500 hours and still learning. Well, Tom, thanks for your email. And I want to tell you about a recent email exchange I had with my friend John Fiskus of the Flight Academy, who we've had on the show. John copied me on an email he'd sent to the CFIs in his flight school, in which he talked about a recent landing accident in Watertown, Wisconsin, that involved November 814, a Cirrus SR20. And coincidentally, Rob Mark and I talked about that accident in the current episode of NTSB News Talk, which is episode 22. In that accident, the flight instructor had just 9 hours of experience in that aircraft type, and the student pilot had 10 hours total time, 6 of which were in the Cirrus. I commented to John that it was odd that the aircraft was so fast on final this time when they had an approach speed of 83 knots, which is just 3 knots fast, on their prior 2 landings at another airport. I wrote, "We just have to do it right every time. We get no credit for past performance." John replied, "That's a concept I've tried to relate to people when they say after an accident, but they were such an experienced pilot. Doesn't matter. Aviation has no memory. We have to do it diligently every time because of our experience, not in spite of it." Well said, John. And please keep in mind that as you get more and more experience as a pilot, it doesn't matter if you've been accident-free over the past 10,000 hours. It's only the next hour that counts. You have to continue to do things right for your current flight because we don't get any credit at all for our past performance. And now here's a short conversation I overheard a pilot have with NorCal Approach a couple of weeks ago when I was working with a pilot on an IPC and a Vision Jet, and we were flying into the Salinas Airport. Now, the conversation was innocuous enough, but see if you pick up what I noticed. And this recording comes from liveatc.net.
NorCal Siren 5 Guru Alpha, you want to CAD. How do you want me to do the local curve?
5 Zulu Alpha, whatever you would prefer. I can give you vectors. You can do the procedure turn, whichever works better for you.
Vectors would be fabulous.
5 Zulu Alpha, fly heading 180, vectors, final, maintain VFR.
180 VFR, 5 Zulu Alpha.
So did you hear that? It's not a big deal, but it gets at the heart of something that pilots sometimes don't understand, and that is the role of pilot in command. Who's in charge of that airplane? Is it you or is it the controller? As a pilot, you should know what you want and communicate that to ATC. ATC will then do their best to accommodate your request. Fundamentally, ATC wouldn't exist if there were no pilots. They are there to serve you and to help keep you safe. Now, I'll give you an extreme example of this, and I wish I had thought at the time to capture the audio so I could share it with you. I was flying in the Stockton, California area when a pilot called NorCal Approach and intimated that he might like to fly an instrument approach. The lady controller's response was brilliant. She said, "Would you like me to choose the approach for you?" She got it. And she was subtly telling the pilot what I'm trying to say to you right now. The interaction between pilots and controllers is a dance, and pilots are supposed to lead. So decide ahead of time what it is you want to do, and only after you've figured that out, then call ATC and tell them what you want. Too often, pilots just push the push-to-talk button and their mouth gets ahead of their brain. They haven't thought about what it is they want to do, and they leave controllers wondering. Now, controllers then have to play 20 questions to figure out what the pilot wants, and that takes up valuable time on what might be a congested frequency. And here's the most common form of that situation that I see way too often. Often when a pilot calls ATC for the first time, they need to give our position, which is not hard to do, but here's what I see. The pilot pushes the mic button, starts to talk, needs to give their position, pauses for a second, and then makes something up. Most commonly, they give the wrong direction from which they're located from the airport. All because they didn't think to figure out ahead of time where they were. Instead, they pushed the mic button and started talking before they thought about what they wanted or needed to say. So please, before calling ATC, think first about what it is that you want, and if you need to report your position, take that few seconds to figure it out before you mash the push-to-talk switch. Otherwise, your brain may become mush, and you won't be clear about your intentions or your position when you talk with ATC. And I wanted to follow up on the discussion we had in episode 406 with safety expert Todd Conklin. That episode drew more emails than most, and if you haven't heard it, I'd encourage you to check it out. I was walking in my favorite park a couple of weeks ago and listening to a recent episode of Todd's Pre-Accident Investigation podcast, and he said something that struck me that I wanted to share with you. First, I should mention that Todd works mostly with companies, not with individuals. Some of these companies are in the aviation industry, but most are not. When he speaks of events, he's talking about accidents or incidents. Todd said, and I quote, "And that's the unique challenge with events, is that for the most part, every event that happens in your organization has never happened before and will never happen again." So Todd was saying that most accidents that occur are new to an organization. By contrast, what you and I often hear pilots say is that there are no new accidents being invented, which is to say that every accident we read about is something that has happened to someone before. But what is likely true for most of these accidents is that the accident type was new to the pilot. It wasn't new to aviation. It may have been well known to many other pilots, but it was not known to the pilot who had the accident. In other words, the pilot was either unfamiliar with the particular circumstances that led them to that accident, or, much less likely, they proceeded with full knowledge of their acts and knew that it could lead to an accident. So in the first case, a lot of accidents happen to low-time pilots, for example, those flying in the mountains without an instrument rating at night, because they're unaware of the dangers involved. And an example in the latter case might be pilots who go buzzing low to the ground, knowing that there's some risk of hitting a wire or other object, but who just figure, it won't happen to me. So, to me, the really excellent pilots are those who don't rest on their laurels, but who continue to be curious and try to learn as much as they can about their airplane, about risk management, and about aviation in general, because you never know what small detail could trip you up. For example, I saw something new a week or two ago that I hadn't encountered before, but it wasn't new to the industry, and I'm sure some of you may have encountered it before. And I'll talk about that next week. Coming up next, our conversation with Rob Mark about the fatal crash of a Cirrus that, in my opinion, was doing a training maneuver that appears to have gone wrong. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And just a quick note, the video that Rob and I are about to talk about is one that was fairly complicated to create, as I had to merge two data sets with different time codes. And that video has been available to Patreon supporters for almost a week. And that's one of the benefits of signing up to support the show, is you get access to these videos. Eventually, I make some of them available public, and I'll let you know when this one becomes available. In the meantime, please consider signing up to support the show via Patreon by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/support. And now let me tell you a little about Rob Mark. He's worked as an air traffic controller and as an airline pilot, corporate pilot, and CFI. Rob publishes the Jetwine blog at jetwine.com, and he's an award-winning journalist. He's also my co-host on the NTSB News Talk podcast. And now here's our conversation with Rob Mark. Rob, welcome to the show. Good to see you again, sir.
Hey, thank you so much for inviting me, Max.
Well, I wish it weren't under these kinds of circumstances, but I think we've got some important information for pilots and some really valuable follow-up to the story we did back in episode 303. We now have the final NTSB report, which tells us what happened, but not why it happened. And when you and I speculate about the how and the why, that's our opinion, because the data can't tell us what the pilots were thinking or trying to do, but we do it for the purposes of safety education. So if you would, go ahead and give us the background for this accident. And then later on, I've created a simulation with data that actually came from the airplane, so we can see second by second exactly what happened in that aircraft in terms of flap settings and the exact pitch and roll and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that really tells the story. In fact, it probably tells the story in better detail than the NTSB report does.
I can't imagine how you did that, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it. But the facts as we know them from the NTSB came out in the recent final report into the crash of November 17 Delta Tango. That was an SR22, a turbo. It came out last week after the airplane had crashed on November 22nd of 2023 near the Shelbyville, Indiana airport in Fairland, Indiana. The airplane went down at 16:46 local time and claimed the lives of a new private pilot and his flight instructor. Now, full disclosure, I knew the flight instructor in this accident, and we knew each other through friends at Chicago Executive Airport. And I also know that the instructor owned an SR22T of his own that had been damaged in a chute pole years before, and he'd rebuilt it with the help of other mechanics, obviously, into a really solid flying machine. I also know that this instructor taught aerobatics in an Extra 300. So the just licensed private pilot had purchased this SR-22 in Greenville, South Carolina, and hired the flight instructor to move the airplane with him from Greenville to Monroe County Airport in Bloomington, Indiana, on November the 19th, 2023, and then also fly with him for a few days in order to meet the insurance requirements and most of all to make the pilot feel comfortable with his new airplane. They flew to the Shelbyville Airport where the accident occurred and conducted several takeoffs and landings. Weather that day was clear with west winds at just 9 knots. During a departure climb from the airport after one of these landings, the airplane slowed and stalled and impacted a nearby cornfield. Post-accident examination of the airplane, along with recorded data, revealed there was no evidence of mechanical anomalies that would have precluded normal airplane operation. The recorded data showed that the airplane was near stall speed and that the stall warning had 8 activations over a 1-minute period just before the airplane descended into the terrain. It was unknown whether the pilot, the flight instructor, or both pilots were manipulating the aircraft's flight controls up to the point of the accident. They also did not know the reason for the duration of the stall warnings over that 1-minute period. There was no deployment of the airframe's parachute. Toxicology results indicated that the pilot had potentially used one or more cannabis products. However, the precise timing of his last cannabis use and whether it had any impact on this accident could not be determined. The National Transportation Safety Board determined the probable cause of this accident to be both pilots' failure to maintain adequate airspeed during departure from the airport, which led to the airplane exceeding its critical angle of attack, entering an aerodynamic stall and impacting terrain. Flight track data showed the airplane departed the Monroe County Airport at 16:05 and flew to the Shelbyville Municipal Airport. There were no reports received by witnesses who saw the airplane during its takeoffs and landings or heard any of the transmissions from the airplane while it was at Shelbyville. A witness who actually found their way to the NTSB through UMAX was traveling southeastbound on I-74 near the airport and saw a small airplane to her left flying southbound over the field. The witness said the airplane was very low and looked stalled or as if it were hovering or hanging. The witness estimated the airplane to be at about 200 feet above the ground. Now, as the airplane approached the witness's position, it took a sharp turn to the left or east, and the witness said that immediately the airplane seemed to lose all control. The left wing dipped. The airplane was fully sideways with the wings vertical before the airplane rotated to the right with the wings vertical. The witness thought the airplane rotated to the left one more time and then leveled out extremely low to the ground. The aircraft disappeared behind some trees at an estimated height of 50 to 100 feet above the ground. A second or two after disappearing behind the trees, the witness saw a fireball and thick black smoke. Post-accident examination of the flight control system confirmed continuity. The wing flap jack screw extension equated to fully retracted wing flaps, while the aileron trim was neutral. Post-accident examination of the engine also showed there were no anomalies that would have precluded operation. Now, as to the two pilots, the FAA airman records show that the pilot was issued a notice of disapproval of application for his private pilot certificate with a single engine rating after he failed the practical portion of the examination on October 31st of 2023. And just a few days later, on November 2nd, during his second attempt, the student pilot passed the examination using an SR-20. At that time, the pilot reported flight times that included a total flight time of 81.4 hours, 72 hours of dual, and 9.4 hours of solo. Now, the 9.4 hours of solo is much less than what's required for a private. It wasn't clear in the report. I'm thinking that maybe that was the amount of time that he had logged in the Cirrus. No pilot logbooks were received from the pilot's estate to clarify any of this. Now, the instructor passed an exam for his initial flight instructor certificate in a single-engine land airplane on November the 3rd, 2020, approximately 3 years before the accident. The instructor had just renewed his flight instructor certificate in December of 2022. At that time, the instructor reported flight times, including total airplane flight time, of 2,267 hours, 652 hours of dual, 2,050 hours in single-engine land, and 137 of total rotorcraft time. The accident airplane was equipped with a recoverable data module that records the flight data in a crash and saves it in a fire-resistant housing. Data is logged up to 5 times per second and stored internally. This data module sustained severe fire damage from the accident that indicated the circuit board had been exposed to temperatures over 138 degrees C. However, the last 2 hours of raw data were downloaded normally. The data module showed no elevator mistrim and that the stall warning was operational. Now, again, the accident occurred at 16:46 and 30 seconds local, and prior to 16:45:33, engine power decreased to about 15%, engine speed decreased to about 1750 RPM, and the airplane airspeed decayed through 79 knots, while the airplane was at approximately 850 feet AGL. Beginning at 16:45:33 until the end of the recorded data, the initial onset of the stall warning for the flight became active. The stall warning activated 8 times and remained active for the last 6 seconds of the recording. After the beginning of the stall warning, there was an increase, although the NTSB doesn't say exactly to what. I'm kind of assuming it was the power lever being pushed forward, that had a positive correlation in engine speed, power, fuel flow rate, and manifold pressure. During this period, the wing flaps were at 0-degree extension. Now, a private forensic pathologist performed the student pilot's autopsy, and according to the autopsy report, his cause of death was multiple injuries, and his manner of death was accident. The autopsy reported traces of cannabis derivative in the pilot's blood, although they could not confirm whether or not it might have affected the pilot's judgment. There were no drugs found in the instructor's blood. So that's what I have on the known data, Max, and I'd love to see how you translated that into some sort of video component.
Yeah, so first of all, let me just mention, I want to extend my condolences to the family and the loved ones of the 2 pilots that died in the crash. It was certainly a terrible accident. And I think the way that we can honor their memory really is to find 1 or 2 nuggets that we as pilots can take away from this and learn from that. And I think there is. And so we'll get into that as we get into the video. We do sometimes hear both from witnesses as well as from family members. The witness who was referenced in the NTSB report heard what I had to say about this accident back in episode 303, which I put out about the time of the crash. We knew a lot less about the crash then. And I encouraged her to contact the NTSB. And I heard back from the investigator who said he was really thrilled to hear from her because he said at that point they had nothing. They had no witnesses. They really didn't have much to go on at that particular point in time. So I want to encourage anybody who ever sees an accident, send an email to witness@ntsb.gov and share what you've seen. And by the way, the data that we're going to see in the video very much lines up with what the witness saw. Her observations were very accurate. She was not a pilot, but she had some experience with aviation, and she made an excellent witness. I did also hear from a family member, and this just came a week or 2 ago on the day that the final NTSB report came out. This family member wrote in part, in your podcast, you assume an engine failure, which is true. I did assume that, which turns out not to be true. And that my family member wasn't a proponent of the caps pull. Now, I didn't assume that. I said that they didn't pull it. He continued, what you didn't know is that my family member owned an airplane that had been in a caps pull, and he took a ton of pride in it. If he ever got the chance to pull the parachute, he would have done it just so he could tell the story. By the way, I agree. I would do exactly the same thing. I'm a strong proponent, and I would never hesitate to use it because I think it's a poor life-saving system, and indeed, I would want to tell that story. He continues, no, he wasn't a CSIP instructor, which is the factory designation for people who've gone and spent a week at the factory as flight instructors learning more about the airplane. He says he wasn't a CSIP because he wasn't going to pay for the politics of it. I don't really know what they meant by that. Continuing on, but that doesn't mean he wasn't a proponent of the parachute. We have countless GoPro videos of him announcing caps available at 600 feet, which, by the way, is the standard call out that Cirrus pilots are taught to make. If you're in an SR22, when you hit 600 feet, you say caps available. You now know that if you've got a problem, that you're at a safe altitude to pull the parachute. He said today the NTSB released their final report. It's impossible to know exactly what transpired in the cockpit that afternoon. However, the student pilot's toxicology report came back positive for marijuana, a drug known to slow decision-making. I suggest that you talk about that on your podcast instead of making assumptions about what an instructor didn't do. So we have just talked about that. And just to go back, here's what I said in part in episode 303. I said, here's how I concluded these pilots had a partial engine failure for the last 69 seconds of the flight. The aircraft descended a total of 600 feet. That translates to a descent rate of about 520 feet per minute. If the aircraft had run out of fuel or if it had a complete engine failure, it would have been descending at more than 1,000 feet per minute. For this particular Cirrus, most Cirrus CSIP instructors train that the aircraft should be above 600 feet AGL in order to successfully use the CAPS parachute system. That means it was above the CAPS altitude for nearly 1 minute and 40 seconds from the time the aircraft started to slow. So in my opinion, this pilot and flight instructor had plenty of time to pull the CAPS parachute, but they apparently decided instead to glide the airplane down to a cornfield where the aircraft crashed and burned. Throughout the descent, the aircraft was clearly under control, which the video also shows. It glided with partial power for about 2 minutes. There were no crazy turns, such as those you typically see when an aircraft is out of control. And the last data point showed the airplane at 87 knots, which is fairly close to the best glide speed of 92 knots. So that's what I had to say about that. Of course, we knew far less about that accident then. We could only look at the ADSB data. We now know from the NTSB final report and from the additional data that they released that came from the airplane's RDM module that the engine was working perfectly fine, and that what I thought was a partial engine failure was actually a reduction in engine power by the pilots. They pulled the power back to about 15% and left it there. That's around 10, 11 inches of manifold pressure. So the big question is, why did they do that? And I've seen a lot of speculation online where people said, oh, I think they were conducting slow flight, or, oh, they were practicing stalls. Neither of which makes any sense. And Rob, you're shaking your head. You agree? Because they were at 800 feet AGL. That's well below the 1,500 feet minimum altitude that the FAA recommends for these maneuvers. So I don't think any CFI, any pilot, would practice those maneuvers that close to the ground. And as I looked through the data, it didn't look like that's what they were doing. But the data does fit extremely well with a simulated emergency approach to landing in a field, which some instructors do. In fact, this is very common in airplanes that don't have parachutes, because that's the only option you have if an engine fails, is you glide down to a field. And in my opinion, that's what they were doing. They were simulating an engine failure, though they didn't have the engine completely off. But for some reason, they were simulating it with about the power level that you would normally use to land. Now, the NTSB reports tell us what happened, and usually we're now left to try and figure out the how and the why. Usually we just have the ADSB data, which is what I looked at after the accident occurred. But in this case, we really have far more data than I have ever seen in an accident before, because that RDM data was published by the NTSB in the docket, which goes along with the final report. And they published pages and pages and pages of graphs showing all those parameters. And I would guess there are at least 50 parameters recorded by the RDM several times a second. But when they published the printouts, what they did was they used different timescales on different pages, which made it almost impossible to line up the data so that you could really get a good picture of what was going on. I spent an hour and a half pouring through that data, and I could pick up little nuggets, but I could never quite figure out the correlation between the different things that occurred in the airplane. But what they did, and I've never seen them do this before, they included a spreadsheet, a .cvs file, that had most of the data from the RDM, or, well, at least 30, 40 parameters, probably not all of it. But that spreadsheet lacked the position data. So they didn't include the lat-long coordinates for each of the data points. So those would have been extremely helpful to plot the aircraft track and kind of put the whole picture together. But what we did have was the ADSB data that had that information, the position data. The problem is that the RDM provided several data points a minute, whereas the ADSB data provided position and altitude data once every couple of seconds. So matching the data up between those two sets of data was just a massive challenge. Also, the RDM spreadsheet had over 16,000 lines of data in it. So I spent about 8 hours yesterday, and I finally figured out a way to mesh the data together and to interpolate the GPS points for the missing points. And so what we got now is a really fairly accurate file of aircraft position, as well as all kinds of cockpit information. So we've got engine data, we've got flap data, we've got information about when the stall warning occurs. We've got all kinds of information about airspeed. First time I've ever seen a simulation where we had 3 different kinds of airspeed. Normally we just have ground speed. In this case, we have the actual indicated airspeed that was shown on the PFD in the cockpit. We also have true airspeed. We also have ground speed. We also have the exact pitch and data recorded in the aircraft. So we know exactly what the attitude of the aircraft was at every moment. And so what I was able to do in flysto.net was create a cockpit view that showed all of this instrument data, all of the engine data simultaneously. And then when I put the video together, I added to it information on the flap position, the stall warnings, and when ESP was engaged. Now, ESP is the envelope stability protection. And what that does is anytime you're pitched up too high, the aircraft kind of grabs the controls and pulls the stick forward to help prevent you, to help keeping you from going into a stall. It also does the same thing if you're banked more than 45 degrees, it rolls you back to 30 degrees. Now, ESP activated 8 times, so we've included that in the video. It was correlated roughly with when the stall warning went off. Now, one other thing that's really important to remember as we go through the data, and that's the published stall speed for the aircraft. So when you've got 100% full flaps down, the published stall speed for this is 64 knots indicated or 61 knots calibrated airspeed. So at full flaps, 64 knots is your indicated airspeed for stalling. If you're at 0 flaps, that goes up to 74 knots indicated. But if you're in a 30-degree bank, that stall speed goes up to 80 knots. So remember that number, 80 knots, 30 degrees of bank, that's when you're in stall. So as the video starts here, you can see we're at about 2,300 feet, so about 1,500 feet above the airport. We're crossing overhead, so they have just arrived and they're going to be entering the pattern. There appear to be 1 or 2 other aircraft in the traffic pattern. We just saw an aircraft fly beneath us. Now, as the aircraft crosses the field, they're not quite perpendicular to the runway. They're kind of crossing the field at a bit of an angle. And when I cross a field, I try and straighten the aircraft up so it's perpendicular. It makes it a little bit easier to enter on the 45. They've cut the power back now to about 25%, 11 inches. They're in a right turn. They're descending through 1,900 feet. And they're going to end up a little too close to the airport because they didn't cross perpendicularly. Also, traffic pattern altitude looks like they're a little low at this point. They're down about 1,600 feet, and we're down at about 1,500 feet now, rolling out. Power's coming back up. It's about 68%, 23 inches. We're around 120 knots, and they're established on the downwind. And they're climbing back up a little bit. You can see they're pitched up about 5 degrees, picking up another 100 feet or so. And now they are established on the downwind. Pretty shortly here, they'll be reducing power and putting in flaps. We're doing 120. There we go. Flaps 50%. And right now this is running at double speed just so that we can get through it a little bit more quickly. We'll slow this up later on. And they've now started their base turn. They're about 105 knots. And they've just added 100% flaps midway through that turn. And they're getting a little bit slow. They're just about to roll out here, and it's 83 knots. And let's see, they're on base. So headed almost due east, 83 knots. Typically, we'd be 90 knots. And they are level. Okay, now they've just started to come back down a little bit. And the speed has picked up. The power came up a little bit. They accelerated to 103 knots. So they're fast for final. Typically on final, we'd want to be around about 80 knots.
Yeah, the rate of descent there is almost 1,200 feet a minute.
Yep, exactly. So the descent rate was a little bit high. Now, it appears that they've lined up a little bit to the right of the center line and that they are going around. So we can see the power has come up to about 80%. We're flying mostly level. The flaps just went up to 50%, and now the power went all the way up to 112%, 36.9 inches, which is slightly in the yellow. They are now climbing out to straight ahead at 1,000 feet per minute. Airspeed's increasing, about 135 knots. Power's coming back a little bit as they start to level out. And it looks like we've got our turn now to the crosswind, doing 130 knots. Power still at 62%, which is just a little bit fast as you level out. And I think we're going to see the aircraft increase speed, which is not uncommon when I fly with relatively low time Cirrus pilots. They just don't pull the power back enough when they level out. Sure enough, we're at 140 knots indicated on downwind. I would say more typically you'd want to be between, say, 100 and 110, 115, something like that. Power's still up at 70%, and we're level at 1,700 feet. Now the power is coming back, and we're spaced out nicely from the runway. This whole approach is going to be much better than the one before. We've got a left turn starting here with flaps 50% to where it looks like we're possibly over the interstate. We're now on base at about 104 knots, so just a little bit fast. And we're now starting our turn to final. And flaps are still at 100%. And let's see. Here we go. So now is the final turn on to final. 89 knots, which is about what we want to be on base, so that's good. Now we're lined up with the runway, 93 knots, coming down 1,100 feet per minute, so a little high on the descent rate. They've got that back in check a little bit. 900 feet per minute, 92 knots. So still a little fast, still coming down a little fast. Power's at 10 inches or 18%. We're lined up pretty nicely with the runway, and this turns out to ultimately be a fairly good landing. And I'll tell you about that. I'll tell you why in just a moment here. So we're at 84, pretty close to the target airspeed of 80. We're at 900 feet, so just about 100 feet above the runway. We're back to 450 feet per minute on the descent. So everything looks really nice and stable. We got a few bumps in the video here, but that's because of how I had to interpolate the data. Now, aircraft's pitched up about 6.5 degrees at touchdown. That is excellent. That is fantastic. As we've talked in the past, Cirrus pilots often land a little flat. This was really, frankly, better than most landings that we see in terms of the touchdown attitude. Okay, so we're back at 1x speed video now, so this is going in real time. The flaps are up at 0. We're climbing out at 100 knots, climbing at about 800 feet per minute. And this will be the segment that ultimately results in the accident about 2 minutes from now. So we're climbing up at 1,200 feet a minute, 110 knots. Power's up at 108%. We're pitched up at about 7 degrees. And of course, that pitch data comes directly from the airplane, so we know that's exactly what they were pitched at. In a moment, they're going to turn crosswind. Here's that turn coming right now. And they're banked about 18 degrees, so a nice shallow bank, which you'd expect. Now they're getting a little bit slow, so they're 92, still climbing 1,000 feet per minute. Power went back up briefly. It's coming down a little bit. It's about 48%. Now we're leveling off here about 1,850 feet, and we're slow. We're at 88 knots. And in a moment, I think we're going to see the power come up. They're perfectly level. Yep, power's coming up. They want a little bit more airspeed. 90 feels a little slow on the crosswind. Power is up at 108, 109%. They're speeding up, and they're staying level, just around 1,820 feet, which would be about 1,000 feet above the field elevation. Now we've slowed the video to 1/3 speed, so everything is going to be progressing at 1/3 the speed that it actually happened. They're on the crosswind, and they're about 1.5 minutes from the accident. Okay, we're level at about 1,800 feet, 113 knots. And they're flying a crosswind that's longer than a typical crosswind. So they're flying out of the pattern, which was certainly one of the things people didn't understand. And now the flaps have come in. They're coming down to 50%. And I've made a note that they were at 50% flaps for 13 seconds. So if you were simulating an approach to a field, then you would want flaps 50 initially. And then, of course, you would ultimately go to flaps 100. We're still level at about 1,800 feet, getting a little slow, 90. That's okay. We'd typically be descending at somewhere around 80 knots, or maybe best glide around 92 knots. Getting just a little slower. Power is set at about 18%, about 10 inches. That's about the power we would normally use to land. Now, here's the first surprise here. Take a look. The flaps just went to 0%. So my expectation would have been that they would go to flaps 100. They went from flaps 50 to flaps 0. Now, ESP just engaged. The aircraft is pitched up at about 6 degrees. They're at 87 knots. And I think that neither pilot knows at the moment that the flaps were raised to 0 instead of lowered to 100%. Now, this is an error that I have seen over the last 20 years, probably at least half a dozen times. People, instead of continuing to put the flaps down, raise them. Now, I think what happened is the flight instructor eventually recognized that, because we'll see the flaps go to 50. We've got a stall warning. ESP just engaged for 2 seconds. We're pitched up almost 8 to 9 degrees. Stall came on again. ESP engaged for 5 seconds. We're at 76 knots. We're pitched very high, still at 0% flaps. 75 knots is just, 1 knot above the stall speed for 0% flaps. ESP has engaged again. We've got the stall horn again. We're speeding up just a little bit because we're starting to descend. And now flaps have gone back to 50%. And they'll be there for 12 seconds. So we had initially flaps 0, then flaps 50, then flaps 0. Now we're back to flaps 50.
But they've left the traffic pattern.
Oh, yeah. We're continuing to fly away from the airport on the crosswind. We're pitched up 9, almost 10 degrees, 77 knots. And we're actually climbing slightly with the flaps still at 50%. Pitched up, 73 knots, 72 knots. Now the flaps were just raised to 0 one more time. They're going to remain at 0 until the crash, which occurred about 30 seconds after this. We're at 74 knots. We're pitched up at about 5 degrees. ESP has just come on again. We're descending at about 500 feet per minute. The stall warning has just come on again. Airspeed is increasing slightly, 80 knots. Now, often when people are doing a simulated landing to a field, they'll make turns. So we were on the crosswind. Now it looks like we're turning left to join what would be perhaps the downwind. We're banked left about 15 degrees. So that turn is starting. We're at 86 knots. And we're banking a little bit more. We're at 20 degrees and we're at 84 knots. And I'm going to have you stop it in just a moment, Rob. So we're at 20 degrees left bank. The aircraft is turning to that downwind. ESP has just come on. It's going to stay on for 7 seconds. We're at 78 knots. We're in that turn to the left. We're about 15 degrees of bank, 20 degrees of bank, and now stop. All right. So what you can see is the aircraft was at 30 degrees of bank. And what do you see for airspeed there?
78 knots.
Yeah. So what I said before was that when you're in a 30-degree bank, the stall speed is 80 knots. And what I saw is the moment that they reached 30 degrees of bank, the aircraft then started to go even further to the left. So let's just go ahead and restart it. And what's happened is the aircraft immediately stalled, the left wing dropped, and it went down to 69 degrees left bank. Okay, I'm restarting here. ESP is engaged for 2 seconds. The stall horn's on. The aircraft is now rolling to the right. It's banked 68 degrees to the right. ESP is engaged again. It's now rolling to the left. It rolled to 102 degrees the left bank. It's pitched down nearly 20 degrees. It then rolls to the right, and it reaches 50 degrees of bank to the right. The stall horn is on, and we have now reached essentially the ground level. So what we saw was the wings rock back and forth exactly as the witness described. And I think as I look at this, I think some people kind of focus on ESP and think that somehow that was contributory to this. I don't think that's the case at all. If anything, I think ESP kept them from stalling sooner than they might have. If ESP were not active and not trying to push the nose down, the stall probably would have occurred earlier. What I think is critical here was a mistake that I said I've seen probably half a dozen times. And here's the problem. People put the flaps down. They'll put one notch down. They may leave it there for 12, 13 seconds. And then they kind of forget, oh yeah, I need to keep pushing down. And then they'll raise the flaps instead. And in my opinion, I think it's likely the flight instructor probably recognized that mistake and said, oh, hey, something's wrong here. And we need to put those flaps back down again. So the flaps went back down to 50. And if I'm right, and again, this is just my opinion, it appears that the pilot made the same mistake again and raised those flaps again rather than putting them down to 100. And I got to tell you, as a flight instructor, I wouldn't expect a pilot to make the same mistake twice. So I think it's pretty understandable that it would get missed the second time. What really stands out for me about the whole video is that the aircraft is pitched up most of the time between 5 and 10 degrees throughout the entire time. In my opinion, the pilots probably thought that they had 100% flaps in, but that's not the pitch attitude you'd expect. If you're set at about 10 inches of manifold pressure as if you were landing and you had full flaps exactly, you're lowering your hand, you're going to be pitched down more like 4 or 5 degrees down below the horizon. The only time I do a landing when I'm pitched up 5 degrees above the horizon is when I'm doing a no flaps landing. And that's part of the challenge of doing a no flaps landing is most people don't do a great job of getting the nose up high enough so that they can maintain the target airspeed of 90 knots when they're doing a no flaps landing. So I think some of the key takeaways here are all pilots make mistakes, all flight instructors make mistakes, and we need to try and correct those as quickly as we can. But another is pitch attitude. I think it's important for pilots to know what the proper view out the windshield should be depending upon your configuration. And if you're set for landing power and you've got full flaps, the nose is going to be below the horizon, not above the horizon.
This video was eye-opening, doesn't even cut it. I think that I found myself watching it, and in those last few seconds, I could feel my heart starting to beat much faster. And I was doing this with my hand. People can't see it, but I'm pushing the stick forward because it's instinctive to me. I don't know what was going on, but I just kept thinking, get the nose down because the airplane wants to fly and it's not flying right now. You know, one thing I didn't see.
Sure.
When the wings started to roll, what was the power set at?
It was still relatively low. Yeah, no, it was nowhere close to full power. It remained relatively low. But here's something that I think is important to understand. From the time the aircraft stalled when it reached 30 degrees of the bank till the time it crashed, 4 seconds. So they were about 450 feet above the ground at the point where it stalled. They had only 4 seconds. The descent rate reached about 3,000 feet per minute. The whole thing was over very quickly. When you figure it banked left and right, twice on each side, that means it did a complete reversal from left to right within a second. So this would be a very violent movement of the aircraft. It would be very disorienting. And of course, recovering it from it at that altitude is going to be virtually impossible. In fact, I would say that at that altitude, 450 feet, with that kind of violent movement, it would take any pilot at least a couple seconds to think, oh, I got to pull the CAPS parachute. And by then, of course, you're too low. So that's one of the dangers of low altitude pulls. You got to use it before you lose it, which is if you get too low, it's not going to help.
Well, now this explains quite a bit. There were so many things moving at one time in the airplane that when I first looked at the data the other day that I downloaded from the docket, the NTSB docket, I couldn't for the life of me figure out how I was going to get my arms around it because there were so many parameters in a format that I simply could not understand. And I guess thanks to you being able to put some of that knowledge to work here and put some put some parameters around this, but I'm just trying to figure out when they departed the traffic pattern out to the west. What do you think they were after there?
Well, I think they were just looking to get away from the traffic pattern so that they could do a simulated approach to landing in a field that was far enough away from the airport that they wouldn't be interfering with the traffic pattern. It sounds like they were turning to parallel the interstate. There were cornfields there. And it seems like it would be a reasonably good place to practice that. Nothing wrong with practicing, what they were doing. But in my opinion, the key was that they didn't recognize how close they were to stalling. It's kind of interesting that each time the flaps were raised from 50 to 0, that's when the stall horn and that's when the ESP would kick in. And that makes kind of sense because when you raise those flaps, suddenly your stall speed goes up. You're a lot closer to stall speed. And that's why we saw all those warnings. When I'm doing this kind of maneuver, I never hear the stall warning throughout the entire maneuver. And I think that's also something that could have let them know, hey, something doesn't seem quite right about this. We're hearing the stall horn a lot. Normally, I don't hear the stall horn. Hey, we seem to be pitched up kind of high. Something doesn't feel quite right. And I think we've all been in that situation, whether it's aviation or not, where something doesn't feel quite right. We don't quite know what it is. And I would say anytime you're in those kinds of situations, just follow your instincts, get out of there, figure out later what it is that didn't perhaps feel right. But it doesn't make sense to just kind of continue in a situation having doubts about where that uneasy feeling is coming from.
Well, that's probably what I was thinking. I mean, not quite as eloquently as you put it, but as I was watching the wings start to rock, I looked at the power. I guess I did see it back, and I thought, get the power in there. I don't know why. I don't know that it would have helped or that it would have saved anything, but I just can't imagine my hand not going for the throttle and jamming the thing in.
Yeah, and I've always read that stall spin accidents in the traffic pattern are almost always fatal and that you're too low to recover. I don't think I've ever seen such a dramatic indication of exactly what that view looks like from the cockpit, how disorienting that is, how rapidly the wings are moving, and how totally confusing it would be. So, yeah, I mean, it's dramatic. I'm not sure I would even encourage people to look at it because, when I finished producing the video and looked at it, it made me feel very, very queasy, sad, unhappy. It's not pretty. But if nothing else, I think people should take away that if you get any kind of stall warning in the traffic pattern, you got to lower the nose.
Yeah. And the dangers of stalling the airplane when you're close to the ground. I mean, that was very dramatic. I mean, if they'd been practicing stalls at 3,500 feet, this wouldn't have seemed like, oh, well, you got to get the nose down. I mean, it would have been much more nonchalant. But I could just watch things happening and knowing that something was going to occur very soon and feeling like I wanted to do something to help, but I couldn't do anything.
Well, hopefully this helps folks in the future if they're in any kind of situation where they hear the stall horn, where they're feeling some level of uncertainty. You've got to honor your instincts because your instincts will often steer you in the right direction. And if something doesn't seem like it's right, maybe it's not. Time to get out of that situation and, improve your safety margins, climb, increase airspeed, do whatever it takes and figure all that out later.
Wow. So, one question I had, Max, is you mentioned the amount of data that was in the docket on this airplane. I have not looked at other dockets as much as you do, but I'm curious. So this is unusual for the NTSB to release so much data. I guess they just happen to have it, right? But there have been other Cirruses that have crashed.
Yeah, maybe I've missed it, but I've never seen them upload a spreadsheet before with this kind of data. So it's new in my experience. Maybe they've done it in the past. I hope they do it in the future because I think it really goes a long way to helping people figure out exactly what happened in a meaningful way that goes beyond the what of the report itself. The what says 2 pilots stalled. And it's easy to walk away from that and go, well, I would never do that. Well, guess what? If you look at the details of what happened, somebody could end up finding themselves in that situation. And it's not as obvious as it might seem. The pilot's stalled. Well, gosh, if you look at all the circumstances that led up to that, you can kind of understand how a mistake here, a minor oversight there, can add up to them not realizing that they were about to have a stall spin accident.
I remember when I got the phone call from a friend of mine at the airport to tell me about this accident. And I mean, I've known about other people that have lost their lives in airplanes, and it gave me pause. And I just said, please. I guess I was lost for words, because it's not like some distant person that I knew nothing of. I had just seen this man maybe a week before, and we had chatted about some various things, and now he's gone. It's so hard to understand that.
Yeah, totally. And I've actually kept a list of pilots that I've known personally face to face, and that's over a dozen names now. And I frankly, I don't want to forget any of them. So all I can say is hold your loved ones closely, and do everything you can to fly safely.
Thank you for putting this together, Max. I don't know how any of us would have made anything out of that data if you hadn't taken the time to produce this video. Again, thanks very much.
Thank you, Rob, and we'll see you soon on NTSB News Talk. Take care.
You betcha.
And my thanks to Rob Mark for joining us here today. You can see more of his work at jetwine.com. And of course, you can hear him on the NTSB News Talk podcast. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support. To support the show financially, you can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.